following different researchers in the wild interacting with octopuses and learning about them. Really cool stuff. Then the small ones on the top, those are of course fictional shows, not documentaries. Finding Dory with Hank the Octopus and the Boy and the Octopus, which was this little Disney short that just came out over the holiday season. This little boy with an octopus that hangs out of his hat. The point is, octopuses are everywhere. They are fascinating, and people really, really seem to like them, as do I. And what I want to talk about today is I'm going to answer 3 of the main questions that I get when people find out that I'm really into octopuses. And then we'll answer a bunch more questions afterward. So the first and absolutely the most common question that I get when I am starting to talk about octopuses is, what is the plural of the octopus? Right? I'm sure you've been asking yourself, why is she saying octopus? Why didn't she say octopi? Okay, so I'm here for you. In addition to being a huge octopus nerd, I'm also a huge language nerd. So I looked into it. I said, okay, the word octopus goes back to ancient Greece. Those are the roots, octo for 8 and pus for foot. However, it's not what the ancient Greeks called this animal. This animal that they put on their pots and they lived with, because there are a lot of octopuses in shallow water around Greece, they actually called it polypus for many feet. I don't know if it's because they just didn't ever bother to count them, or if they were a little worried, like maybe we got it wrong. Maybe this one it's going to have more or less, which is call it many feet. But the word octopus really doesn't show up very often in any sort of ancient Greek writing. What you'll find instead is polypus. And then the Romans took that word, as they took a lot of things from ancient Greek, and put it into Latin as polypus, spelled slightly differently. Now, in Latin, this would have been pluralized polypi. That would be the pluralization of this word. The octopus would have been one octopus, 2 octopuses, 1 polypus, 2 polypi. The word octopus doesn't really come into common usage until this nerd, Linnaeus, decided that he was going to name everything in the world. Carl Linnaeus, very famous for creating the categorization and taxonomic system that biologists use today with a genus and a species and all of the other stuff that goes on top of that. And he used this word octopus, 8 feet, for the animal that we know of as an octopus. And because he was such a huge nerd, he wanted to pluralize it in the correct ancient Greek way, as if it were an ancient Greek word, which is octopodes. Octopodes is a beautiful word. I welcome you all to use it as much as you like. But it does, I have found, tend to derail the conversation. If somebody wants to talk to you about octopuses and you start talking to them about octopodes, pretty soon you're not really talking about octopuses anymore, you're talking about ancient Greek. So what I would say is that these are the 2 plurals that people use most often, octopi and octopuses. Octopi is arguably incorrect because it's not really a Latin word, but if it were a Latin word, it would be pluralized octopi, and Latin borrowed all kinds of things from Greek. So you know what, go for it. It's in the dictionary even, so don't worry about it. If you really like octopi, you have justification for it. I tend to use octopuses because it seems like in some ways the most innocuous option. Octopus is just an English word, and we'll just pluralize it like other English words, as if everything in the English language were completely normal and full of rules. I'm not done with etymology, but we are getting into some more anatomy and biology now, because I wanted to bring us from octopuses into the larger group that they belong to, the cephalopods, because we're going to be talking a little bit about their cousins, the squid and the cuttlefish and the nautiluses today. Mostly octopuses, but a little bit about the whole group. And cephalopod means head foot. And the reason this whole group is called headfooters or cephalopods is the way their body is organized. So I've got here a squid on this side and an octopus on that side. And you can see that the head, no, it doesn't show. Anyway, look for the word head, I believe in you. It's right in the middle. So instead of our bodies, which have a head on the top and then a body and then the arms attached to the body, an octopus or any other cephalopod has the head in the middle. And then attached to that head on one side are the arms, and on the other side is the body, which we call the mantle. And that's what has all of the organs inside it, the gills, the hearts, the stomach, the ink sac, all of that cool stuff is stuffed inside the mantle. Now you'll notice a couple of differences between squids and octopuses. Squids have fins. Most octopuses do not. There are exceptions. We can get into them later if you want. But typically, a squid's lifestyle is swimming in the open ocean like a fish kind of lifestyle. And so they are moving in groups like schools of fish called squads of squid, and they use their fins to help them move as they are constantly swimming around. They also use these two long tentacles to shoot out really fast and catch their food. Now, this is one of the fun facts you can take home and start pushing your glasses up your nose and correcting everybody. You know, octopuses do not have tentacles, technically. That said, many people call their arms tentacles, and it's really not a big deal. In casual English, a lot of words have multiple meanings, and that's fine. But scientifically speaking, tentacles are appendages that have suction cups just on the end, and no suction cups on this part. This part is elastic, and it can shoot out and retract really fast. That's a tentacle. And an arm has suction cups along the whole length. And that's what octopuses have. They have 8 of those arms with suction cups along the whole length. Okay, so just to make sure we're clear about what is the mantle and what is the head, and what is the body and what is not, I wanted to walk through some of the common ways of illustrating octopuses. This is all my art, by the way. I like to do silly little doodles to try to clarify science. And so I did a few over here. This is a really common way to draw octopuses, especially in children's literature, but it's making the whole mantle the head, which is incorrect. You need to have a separate mantle as a place to put all of your organs, so that's wrong. I mean, I don't think I need to say anything about that. It's not a nose, don't get a nose. The correct way to draw an octopus is with the head and the eye in the middle, the body hanging off one side and the arms off of the other side. Now, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, and because I like to get a little bit, a little bit into sort of that fine line between humor and horror, I wanted to tell you how to turn your own body into a cephalopod, should you ever wish to do so. It's a very simple 3-step process. I told the 5th graders not to try this at home. I think in this room that probably goes without saying. But I feel like this is, in addition to just being sort of a silly way to think about cephalopods, for me, it really gets me into that mentality of what it would be like to be in a completely different body, organized in a completely different way. If you're swimming or crawling around and your arms are all around your mouth, and you can reach out and get food and bring it directly back to your mouth, but then you have this sort of vulnerable body that you have to protect. And in the case of cephalopods, a lot of times they use camouflage. They'll take that mantle and cover it with different colors, or even different textures to make it blend in so that it doesn't get grabbed by a hungry shark or eel. Okay, where was I going with this? Oh yeah, cephalopods are horrifying. We love them, but they are a little bit different from what you're used to, which brings us to big question number 2 that I get when I'm starting to talk about octopuses and cephalopods. Are octopuses aliens? It comes up from time to time. You may have seen claims on the internet about octopuses coming from outer space, or even just some of their genetic material coming from outer space. There's sort of some fringe ideas that don't really have any basis in science that keep coming back. And it's understandable to me that people keep connecting octopuses to aliens because, as I said, they're really weird. And I just wanted to point it out this time with a photo of an octopus. They really can turn their body into any shape at all. And that's just not something we're used to from our own bodies or from any other animal. A lizard is shaped like a lizard. A snake is shaped like a snake. Even a snail is shaped like a snail. And these guys can do almost anything with their bodies, in addition changing the color and texture of their skin to make whatever they're doing with their bodies that much weirder and more convincing if it's camouflage. And they have these appendages that are really found very few other places, almost no other places on Earth. They have these suction cups lining their arms that can taste, that can touch, that can even grasp and really carefully, almost like our fingertips, and move things around. Then, of course, they have these weird eyes. The eyes are what drew me first to an octopus, that it was looking back at me, but they're also strange. So the octopus's eyes can see, can form images, can recognize things. We'll get a little bit more into how they learn what their surroundings are later. But also their pupils are horizontal. They can change shape. Some of them have sort of W-shaped pupils. They're just weird. They have this siphon that squirts out water and ink. Ink! Who else makes ink? It's very weird. And of course, their they have 8 arms, and they're flexible, and they can make any shape just like the rest. So this is an understandable question to me. And in fact, a bunch of famous science fiction has connected octopuses or something shaped like a cephalopod with aliens. Going back to the War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, because Martians were very cephalopodin in nature. And then H.P. Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, a very sort of octopus-like, cephalopod-like creature that is not from Earth, not of Earth. And I will say that some things that scientists have written have not made it easier to separate octopuses and aliens. Martin Wells, the grandson of H.G., author of War of the Worlds, was an octopus biologist. And he wrote the book on octopuses for a long time. It was called Octopus. And in Octopus, he wrote, the octopus is an alien. And you're like, come on, Martin. We're trying to not make people think they're aliens. But his point was, and again with the English language and words having multiple meanings, he was using the word alien to mean something completely strange to us, something that we cannot relate to. And he went on to explain why. It's a poikilothermos, a fancy word for being cold-blooded. It never had a dependent childhood. It has no social life. And he makes this really good point. This animal lives in a different world from our own. We can't assume that it has the same types of feelings we do and the same types of relationships we do because everything about it is so different. And then in 2015, the first genome of an octopus was sequenced. And Cliff Ragsdale, this amazing scientist who is the lead author on the study, referenced Martin Wells. He's saying, Martin Wells said the octopus is an alien. In this sense, our paper describes the first sequenced genome from an alien. Headline writers went wild, alien genes on Earth, you know. None of that is true. But the point is there is that we have to balance in our head. These animals are related to us, related to all other animals on Earth. And at the same time, it's amazing the direction that they have evolved and the strange features that their bodies have. And so I'm going to take a little bit of time now to talk about how they evolved here on Earth and how they got to be these incredible, bizarre weirdos that we can still see by looking at their genes and looking at their fossil record and how they're connected to everything else. And it is the story of how the octopus lost its shell. You do not need to spend too long trying to memorize this diagram. I just wanted to show you this family tree, which is from my book, Monarchs of the Sea, which is going back in time. The top is all of the modern cephalopods that we have. You could see an octopus up there, a nautilus, a couple of squids, some of the different modern cephalopods we have. And at the bottom is the very earliest cephalopod, Plectronasceris, and it had a shell. All of the early cephalopods had shells. So I'm going to take a moment to explain why the shell was so important and then how they lost it. But we have to remember how long ago this was. So this is before humans. This is also before dinosaurs. This is actually before plants. So 500 million years ago, there's nothing living on land except algae. I apologize if there's phycologists in the audience, anybody who loves algae, there was algae on land. But there were no trees, there were no big plants, there were no animals. Pretty much everything big was living in the ocean, and it wasn't even that big. I mean, like big enough that you can see it as opposed to bacteria or viruses or things. So this is more or less what the ocean looked like, and it was starting to be full of more and more different types of animals. This is a time that scientists call the Cambrian explosion, that all the different little squiggly, wormy things were starting to diversify into more and more shapes. We have early trilobites, early shrimp-like things, and a lot of them were starting to eat each other. So there was a lot of predation happening at this time. And in response to that predation, one group of animals evolved the seashell. It was a very exciting time for them because this was the first real structured armor against predators, and they could hide in it and not get eaten. This was a group called the mollusks, which includes all of our modern snails, slugs, clams, mussels, and all the cephalopods. And at this point, these early mollusks started to break into different groups, and the one that would become the cephalopods had that shell slowly evolve to have gas inside it. So over time, they were secreting more and more structure inside the shell and the inside of the shell, which had been filled with the body and with the fluid and the seawater around them, ended up being filled with gas that came out of their bloodstream. And it was like holding a balloon, and it lifted them up off the seafloor so that they could really be the first animals that were swimming around actively instead of crawling or burrowing on the seafloor. This is a little diagram trying to explain the way it happens. It took scientists quite a long time to figure this out. They had to spend a lot of time looking at the modern nautilus, which is the only cephalopod that still has this kind of shell. But the way that it works, the way that the shell gets filled with gas, is there's a tube called the siphuncle, which is Latin for little tube. And it's fancy, right? The little tube of the siphuncle has part of their bloodstream flowing through it, and they can actually make that blood extra salty, which then, if you remember chemistry lessons, the salty blood will actually draw fluid into it because it's so salty through osmosis. Draw the fluid into it to make it less salty, and then you get this empty space in the shell where that fluid comes out, and that pulls gas that had been dissolved in the blood into the shell. It's a lot. It's okay if it doesn't immediately make sense. I had to do a lot of reading to try to even make it make sense to me. But the point is, they ended up with these gas-filled shells. They were like little dirigibles, little airships that could float around and start picking up food. And once they had that shell, they could also get really big. Because the shell of a snail is too heavy for the snail to get very big. The shell of a clam is somewhat limiting because it's a big, heavy shell that they have to build and then move around with if they're going to try to move, as some of those animals do. But these animals, the bigger the shell got, the more room they had for gas. And so they could just make these enormous shells. These were the first giants on planet Earth. This was way before dinosaurs, way before sharks, way before all of the big animals that we think of as being big prehistoric animals. And they were enormous. There were no people in suits or scuba diving gear, by the way. These are just there to show you how large they got, these early cephalopods. And they were able to really dominate the seas. We're going into now 450 million years ago until somebody came along, the first fish. And so these early fish evolved jaws that were really hard. They were able to start breaking shells, prying open shells, pulling the animals out of the shells. And so this was a problem. The jaws of fish were making it so that all of these shelled cephalopods had to adapt or die. They didn't go extinct, spoiler. Instead, they evolved into two different types of groups. The first one coiled up the shell to get it out of the way. Like if you have your long hair and it's getting caught on the trees as you run, then you can coil it up in a bun and it won't get caught anymore. They actually evolved coiled shells that made it easier for them to swim around and maneuver, made it harder for fish to catch them. And this was two different groups of cephalopods, the nautiloids and the ammonoids. The ammonoids, of which this one with the weird spines is representative, became super abundant. Ammonites, which is a subset of ammonoids, are really common fossils for people who like to go fossil collecting and hunting. Ammonites, along with trilobites, are some of the most fun to collect, a whole bunch of. They have lots of different weird shapes. Nautiloids kind of look like modern nautilus from the beginning and haven't really changed all that much, at least in the shape of their shell. We don't really know what might have changed in their soft body. But these guys did okay for themselves. But then, of course, we have the other branch of the cephalopod family tree, and they evolved internal shells. Now this is not a cephalopod, but I put it up here to show how even some snails today, this is a type of sea snail called a cowrie, and they will sometimes wrap the skin of their body all around the outside of their shell. And we think that it may have been something like this that the early cephalopods in this particular group started with, and then they evolved to having completely internal shells. This is a fossil of an early relative of squid. And on the inside of it, that sort of crushed white shell material is the internal shell. And it was very similar to the shells that other cephalopods had. It's just inside the body because you can see in the rock also an imprint of the soft body that would have been on the outside of this shell. And this group of cephalopods is called coleoids. Coleoid is from the Greek word for scabbard. So it's like putting the sword into the scabbard that put the shell inside their body. And these were the early relatives of squids and octopuses and everything that we have today. And they were able to start really competing with fish in a new way. Because once that hard shell was inside the body, they could swim way faster, They were way more maneuverable. They could really become more fish-like. And in particular, they evolved a lot of the things that we're familiar with from a modern squid or octopus. Here's one that's showing how they could draw water into the body and squirt it out through the siphon in jet propulsion. Now, cephalopods had been swimming with jet propulsion for a while, but when they had the shell inside the body, they were able to really kind of unlock all the potential of this method of moving by really filling their whole body with water and expanding it, and then squirting all of that water out of a siphon so that would propel them in the opposite direction. If you've ever held a garden hose and turned it on full blast, you might have actually felt it push you a little bit. That's kind of how jet propulsion works underwater. So all three of these groups, the two coiled ones and the internally shelled ones, were really, really successful for a really long time. These are two different fossils, just showing how abundant they could get in some parts of the ocean. The coils here are ammonite shells, and all of these things that look kind of like needles or bullets are the internal shells of those early squid-like things called belemnites, because the rest of their body usually didn't fossil, but these hard bits of their internal shells did. They're so abundant, in fact, that there's one fossil of a shark, or early shark relative, that ate a whole bunch of these and then died, and its stomach is preserved like full, just like packed full of these fossils, and I think that it might have actually kind of overdosed on early squid and gotten so full that it couldn't swim, died in the water. Pretty amazing. So these guys were doing pretty well for themselves. And then Earth had a really bad day. This was the end of the Cretaceous. So you might have heard of it as the day that ended the dinosaurs. I think of it as the day that ended the cephalopods. But of course, in both cases, some of them survived. So this really no good, horrible, terrible, very bad day when an asteroid crashed into planet Earth, set off a bunch of fires, led to a whole bunch of climate disaster, and on and on and on and on, killed off a large percentage of life on planet Earth. But, of course, we have birds with us today, the modern representatives of dinosaurs, the ones who survived. And of course, we have octopuses and squid and nautiluses and all of the other great cephalopods that we have. And it's amazing to see what we have left from what there was and how those descendants have in turn diversified and thrived. I mean, we have everything from emus and cassowaries to parrots and parakeets and pigeons, and other birds that don't start with the letter P that I can't think of right now. And of course, octopus is diversified so that we have the giant Pacific octopus, and we have the tiny little octopuses that you can keep in your home, and you have deep sea octopuses that look like vampires and just amazing stuff. So what happened with those guys, the ones who survived and thrived in the modern oceans, is that internalizing and reducing that shell really opened up the doors, in a sense, to a huge number of other innovations. Because once the skin's on the outside and they can't protect themselves in a shell anymore, that's when they evolved their incredible camouflage. So there is a cephalopod in this photo, right in the middle. It's a particular kind of cephalopod called a cuttlefish that's famous for really, really exceptional camouflage. And in this case, it's camouflaging to look exactly like the sandy bottom that it's hanging out on. So this is a camouflaged cuttlefish related to squid, related to octopuses. And at the same time as that skin on the outside of their body was evolving camouflage and the ability to change patterns and colors, their arms were developing all of these incredible suction cups that we've already talked about a little bit, what they can do with those. And once the body had all of this weirdness as sort of at the same time, they had to find a way within their body of controlling it. Because if you think about how we move our body, we have joints. And so there's really like a limited number of ways that we can move our body, and we never have to do anything about changing the patterns on it, changing the texture of it. Like sometimes we get goosebumps, but we don't have to like control that. It's not like we get goosebumps when we need to blend in with a certain background. And so cephalopods were evolving at the same time this very complex nervous system. And so this is a diagram of the brain, the central brain of the octopus, as well as the distributed nervous system of control going throughout its body. They have about 500 million neurons, And 2/3 of those, so neurons are brain cells, nerve cells that we have in our brains and in our spine and then throughout our body. In octopuses, 2/3 of those are distributed throughout their arms and their skin to help control the kind of unlimited movement of their arms, the suction cups, the pattern and color change. And sometimes people even call this density of neurons in the arms separate brains. So have you ever maybe heard the factoid that octopuses have 9 brains? I feel like that's gone around a little bit. It's counting up these 8 collections of neurons in the arms as a brain and then adding the central brain, which I think is fine. Again, like what is a brain? You could get into a lot of really interesting debate about how many neurons and how densely packed they have to be to constitute a brain. But there's clearly a lot of processing power in the arms. And the skin itself can detect and respond to light in ways that scientists are just beginning to figure out, which is absolutely amazing. And so this is starting to bring us to the third and final question, which I get all the time, because honestly, it's one of the most interesting things about these animals. How smart are octopuses, right? I mean, how many of you came here tonight hoping that I would talk about this, talk about their behavior and their escapes from aquariums, all that stuff? Great, good, now I'm here. Thank you for sitting with me while I talk about their evolutionary history. We are now gonna get into how they trick aquarium keepers and make friends and enemies and all that good stuff. These are some more of my silly doodles about octopuses doing things that octopuses don't actually do in the wild. But let's find out what they actually do in the wild. However, I need to take a tiny detour to stand up for all of the other cephalopods. Because octopuses really get almost all of the attention when it comes to thinking of intelligent cephalopods. Every now and then someone will ask me, are squid as smart as octopuses? Nobody ever asks me, are nautiluses as smart as octopuses? So I'm gonna tell you right now, we have no idea. But we should find out. People have done some experiments with nautiluses, and they can learn. They can actually learn how to solve a maze, and they can remember that information, which is honestly more than anybody expected from them. So I think that they may yet have behaviors that surprise us, but they're kind of difficult to work with. They're not easy to keep in captivity. They are not abundant in the wild. And so there's kind of a limited amount of research on nautiluses, not because they're stupid, but because they're hard to study. Now, some other cephalopods are a little bit easier to study. Squid, for example, that I mentioned tend to swim free in the open ocean. Well, a lot of them swim in relatively shallow water where it's relatively easy for people to dive or snorkel with them. And this particular species of squid called the reef squid has actually been studied so much that some scientists think it has a kind of language. They've been able to study the patterns on their skin that they use to communicate with each other and shown that there's repeated patterns responding to different things in their environment, creating responses in each other. We don't speak it fluently or at all, but people are starting to understand a little bit about what they're saying to each other, which I think is very exciting. But squid are also hard to keep in captivity. They do need a lot of space. They do need to swim a lot. And so that's why most of this work has been done in the wild, which has some challenges associated with it. Getting into the cuttlefish here. Cuttlefish are not as open ocean swimmers as squid for the most part, so they're a little bit easier to keep in captivity. And they have been given some really cool intelligence tests if you want to, or just behavioral studies if we want to not attach too many labels to it. Cuttlefish are famous for being able to pass the marshmallow test. Now, has anybody heard of the marshmallow test for human children? A few people may be familiar with it. The idea is you take a poor child, you offer that poor child a marshmallow, and then you say, if you don't eat this marshmallow, I will come back and give you 2 marshmallows. And then the poor child has to sit there in front of the marshmallow and go, what am I doing with my life? Why did my parents say that I could participate in science? But the idea is this is a study of self-control. How much do we have the ability to look into the future and say, if I do something difficult now, then I can get something better in the future. And cuttlefish can do that. Cuttlefish really like live shrimp. That's their favorite prey. And so what scientists did is they were actually able to train cuttlefish to understand different symbols in their aquarium that would show when is a live shrimp available, and when is just a dead piece of prawn available. And using that training setup, they were able to set up an equivalent to the marshmallow test. You can have this piece of prawn right now, or you can wait and have a live shrimp later. And they were actually able to wait for, I believe, 40 to 50 seconds, which, you know, they only live for a couple of years, so. And it's actually comparable to what a lot of vertebrates, a lot of animals with backbones are able to do in this kind of test, like some monkeys and macaws, I think, that I've looked at. So non-octopuses, very cool and interesting behavior. I just need to say that before we get into the octopuses. But octopuses have way more research on them because they are way easier to keep in a laboratory. They tend to be sedentary. They tend to sit on the ground, so they're not swimming around, bumping into things and needing a huge enclosure. They have a den. They're actually, in some ways, the most similar to us in their behavior. And I think that might be one of the reasons that we connect with them. Because a lot of these, pretty much all these other animals are swimming in 3 dimensions, which is a weird thing for us. Like, we really only get that experience when we train as astronauts and go into space. The rest of the time, we're operating mostly in 2 dimensions. And octopuses are too. Most of them spend most of their time on the sea floor. They're not swimming around exploring 3 dimensions. They're exploring the ground. They might be going under rocks or over rocks, like we might go down into a tunnel or over a mountain, but they're on the surface and they have a den, a home that they return to after they go out foraging and exploring and meeting other animals, which is kind of what we do, right? We leave our den in the morning and we go out foraging and meeting others, and we come back to our den. So octopuses are going to be the subject of most of the rest of the stories that I'm telling. At which point I also have to remind us that Squidward is in fact an octopus. He has all of the correct behaviors, right? He walks around on the ground instead of swimming wildly through the ocean. He's antisocial, which is another important thing about octopuses. Most of them are not living in groups the way squids do, and cuttlefish often do as well. They tend to live solitary lives and engage in cannibalism whenever they encounter another octopus, which sounds like something Squidward would do. I don't know, is that in the show? I haven't watched all of the show. I don't think that comes out. Anyway, so here we go. We are going to talk about some of the really cool things that octopuses do, and then get into questions. So I think probably one of the things that octopuses are most famous for is escaping. We love it. We love a good escape, right? Shawshank Redemption style, octopus style. And it comes up in fiction. This is the main plot of Finding Dory, Hank escaping with Dory. And it happens in real life. This is a book by Simon Montgomery about a real octopus in his New Zealand aquarium named Inky, who one night got out of his tank, not only out of his tank, but through the drain pipe and all the way out to the ocean. Full and complete escape back to the wild. A much happier ending than a lot of octopus escapes have, because sometimes octopuses get out of their tanks, can't find their way back in or back to water, and do dry out and die. Which is why when I kept a pet octopus before I got the octopus, my dad and I got plastic and duct tape, and we just covered every possible opening of the tank. It's a very important thing to do when you keep a pet octopus. So octopuses have been escaping from aquariums literally as long as people have been keeping them in aquariums. So the first aquariums were invented in the mid-1800s. The first documented octopus escape from an aquarium is from 1873. So the science behind how an octopus engineers its escape is quite cool. First of all, they're so squishy. I know we've covered this already, but I just needed to show you a photograph. Basically, the story with an octopus's body is if it can get the one single hard part of its body through an opening, which is the beak that it uses to eat, which is kind of like a bird's beak, but also kind of different. If it can fit that beak through, then the rest of its body can go through no problem. A huge benefit of losing the shell, wouldn't you say? And at the same time, they're really good at viewing and mapping their surroundings. Scientists have found that octopuses in the wild have a really great mental map of their surroundings, so they can go out and forage in one area and another area and then return in a new way because they still know the way back to where their den is. And so these two things combined can lead to a successful escape attempt, which is most impressive. And then, of course, we have the inverse of escape, which is the octopus helping something else to escape into its belly, which they love to do. So this is an example of something that happens all over the world in all kinds of different fisheries. humans trap fish or crabs or lobsters, something that humans want to eat. But then they don't take it out of the trap right away because they can't, because there's always a cycle of putting down the crab pots over here and getting the crab pots over here. While the food is trapped, the octopus comes along and says, "Thank you very much for trapping this delicious crab or lobster or fish," extracts it, eats it, and leaves. This is an example of that happening. This octopus is actually leaving, having consumed the crab that's left behind as just sort of an empty carapace. This also happens in captivity. There's an incredible story of an octopus in an aquarium with sharks in the same aquarium, and the sharks started to disappear. Now, these were not huge great white sharks. These were smaller reef sharks, but still substantial. But the octopus was substantial too. And when they put in a camera, they were able to document this octopus actually preying on the sharks, actually saying, "Great, you put more food for me in this aquarium." And this really highlights something about octopuses, which is that they are predators and they are generalists. For the most part, they will learn to eat whatever food they can find, even if it isn't something that they've eaten before. It's really impressive. And behind that ability to learn is some really fantastic senses. So this is a diagram of the octopus eye compared to the human eye, because they are, again, like us, visual hunters. They're really, really great at spotting movement, spotting their prey. It's because their eyes work very similar to ours. They have lenses, they have effectively a retina, a layer of photoreceptive cells, and they're actually better than our eyes in one particular way. Because the way our eyes evolved, we actually have a blind spot. Our brains are really good at compensating for it, so you almost never see it. You actually have to kind of trick yourself into seeing it by doing some sort of optical illusion. But there is a spot in the back of our eyes, in our retina, where no light lands, because that's where the nerves are coming out and connecting back into our brain. Octopus eyes are arranged differently so that the nerves are already on the outside of the retina, and there doesn't need to be a blind spot for the nerves to get out. It's frankly better setup. They also, as I've been mentioning several times, learn really fast. So if they're finding a new food item, if they have to figure out how to open a type of clamshell they've never opened before, they'll experiment, they'll try new things, and they will figure out how to do it. This is a diagram of an experiment that was done with octopuses in the laboratory, showing them different totally weird things, like here's a vertical line and here's a horizontal line, and associate this one with food and this one with not food. Whatever it is, they'll learn it, even if it isn't something that they would ever encounter in the wild. They're really good at picking up new things and learning what those new things mean, those new messages. Which brings us to experimenting with new tools and toys. Octopuses are in fact tool users, and again, in the laboratory or in the aquarium setup, people will often give them things to play with. In fact, it's considered good care if you have a pet octopus or if you have an octopus in an aquarium to offer them what's called enrichment. Toys to play with, things to put their food in a jar so they have to open a jar, give them Legos, give them Mr. Potato Heads. The octopuses, so I think of this as human-led enrichment, people giving the octopuses things to play with, which is great, and I think it's good, and people are doing all kinds of good exploration of it. But I think it's even cooler when you end up with octopus-led enrichment, when the octopuses find something that was not meant to be a toy for an octopus or a tool for an octopus. As in the case of this researcher who had an underwater camera that the octopus decided it would prefer to be using. And so the top here is a photo taken by the researcher of the octopus, and below here we have a photo taken of the researcher by the octopus using the same camera. And so they really are creative, inventive creatures that are curious about the world around them. And when I use words like that, I always have a little Martin Wells in the back of my head saying the octopus is an alien. You cannot assume that its feelings are like those of a human. And I'm like, yes, Martin Wells, I think that's a really good thing. This is a normal conversation to have, by the way. This is a really good thing to keep in mind, to remember that we want to be expanding beyond our human experience, rather than cramming all of the world, other animals, plants, living things into our human experience. I think it's more about expanding what we see and what we perceive as possible into the experiences of other organisms. And so I think that using the word curiosity to describe what they're doing is great, because it expands our idea of what curiosity even is as something that's possible in an animal like this. And in the wild, they do all of these things too. So it's not like they're just restricted to having animals in a laboratory setting or an aquarium setting. The coconut octopus is famous, as octopuses go, for carrying around coconuts until it needs to hide, and then hiding and putting the two halves of the coconut together to protect itself. It's pretty amazing tool use. It's sort of coming full circle. They lost the shell so they can do so many cool things, but then they figured out a way to bring a shell with them when they need it for protection. Octopuses will also play in the wild. This is kind of the best diagram I could find, because it's hard to find actual photos of octopuses playing with things, but this idea that they'll interact with things in their environment. They'll push little balls around, move rocks and move pieces of algae and things in ways that are not directly beneficial to them. It's just exploration behavior, and it seems to be something that they will do when they're feeling calm and relaxed and they've had enough to eat. And it's really hard to think of it as anything but play. Play-like behavior. It's very cool. Okay, and so now we get to the part of the octopus intelligence and octopus behavior story about how they interact with other organisms. Now, I already mentioned that octopuses are kind of antisocial and they tend to eat each other, but they will interact with members of other species. Pretty amazing. And so this example of Hank and Dory becoming friends has a fascinating counterpoint in real science. And this is from the documentary My Octopus Teacher, The Octopus and the Human. The way that the human filmmaker described it, he had a relationship with this octopus. They recognized each other, they had affection for each other. It's hard to know, what does an octopus feel that is similar to or different from what a human feels? But do they have relationships? I think it's unquestionable that they do, because a relationship is just two beings perceiving and interacting with each other. And they certainly have the memory and the ability to remember different individuals. We know that they communicate, and they communicate with each other. This is an example of an octopus in a place called Octopolis, which, unlike most other places where octopuses live, has a kind of it's like high density housing for octopuses. And there's quite a lot of octopuses living in a small space. And the way they do it without eating each other is they've developed a way of communicating with each other. This is one of the classical poses. They call it Nosferatu pose, because it looks sort of like the vampire with a cape around it. And then this is, of course, a blue-ringed octopus that has these bright blue rings that are communicating directly. I'm poisonous, don't eat me. I'm venomous, technically. And it's not like this all the time. It just flashes those blue rings when it perceives a threat, when it perceives that something in its environment needs to be informed of its venomous nature. We also know that octopuses can cooperate with each other without eating each other. It's pretty amazing. So these are two octopuses of a species called the Pacific striped octopus, and they blew scientists' minds when the first observations were made of this species hanging out in this posture, which is arms to arm, mouth to mouth, really, really dangerous if you're a cannibal. But these guys don't seem to eat each other. They have evolved a way to communicate with each other, to say I'm not a threat, and in particular, they get into this posture for mating. And so they'll exchange the mating material, and they'll actually live in a den together to take care of eggs, which is basically unheard of among other octopus species. This is what I was going to get into, that equivalent of Hank and Dory. So this octopus and this fish are cooperatively hunting. Octopuses and fish will form little hunting groups where they will work together to flush prey out. So the fish can maybe spot a crab that's hiding under a rock, but it doesn't have the ability to chase that crab out. So then it'll point, like a pointer dog almost, for the octopus, so the octopus knows where the prey is. And then the octopus will use its arms or its web to get the crab out, and they'll actually take turns eating the prey. One of my favorite parts of this is that then they will actually sort of work on making sure that there's a fair shakeout for everybody, and if there isn't, then there will be a confrontation. So this is, let me go back here. This is a picture of one of those octopuses actually punching one of its fish hunting partners, who it was perceiving as a freeloader, doing no work but eating some of the prey. If you want to, you can actually find little short video clips of this online, octopuses punching fish, which is absolutely amazing. And going back to Octopus, where that Nosferatu pose is from, these octopuses, if just communicating with pattern and gesture isn't enough, they will throw things at each other. Now, if you're an octopus, throwing something actually doesn't mean using your arm to throw it, because underwater that kind of thing isn't strong enough to make it really move. They use their siphons, that same thing that they're squirting out water and swimming with. They'll hold whatever they want to throw with the arms and then use the siphon to squirt water at it, like a jet of water, to make the rock or the sand or whatever go at their opponent. It's pretty great behavior. So clearly, like, these are ways of interacting with other members of their own species and other species that they have, that they're capable of forming relationships with and having regular communication with. So to get back to the question of how smart is an octopus, people often ask, is it as smart as a dog? Well, compared to a dog, an octopus has a similar number of neurons. Those are the nerve cells in the brain and throughout the body. They both solve problems. They both are able to learn and remember. Does anybody have a pet dog in the audience, by the way? Does this track with your experience? Your dogs learn and remember things? There's individual variation, right? Some of them are a little more capable than others. Your dogs play. That one's at least a little more. They might use tools. It's maybe a little debatable what counts as a tool if you're a dog. I always like to think about crows, though, because crows are not domesticated animals, but they have learned how to interact with humans. The crow has way more neurons than an octopus. The crow solves problems, it learns and remembers. It definitely uses tools. In fact, crows will make tools of their own if they need to. They'll take a wire and bend it into exactly the right shape they need to get some food out of a place that they would be able to reach with their beak. And they definitely engage in play behavior. There's incredible footage of crows rolling in snow, which is one of my favorite things, just to have fun, just to roll in the snow. But these are both animals with backbones. So in some ways, it doesn't surprise us that much that they have these features that we think of as being complicated brains or intelligent behavior, because they, like us, have backbones. They are vertebrates. They're in this group of animals that we think of as being very capable. But there are other animals, invertebrates, without backbones, that have really interesting overlap with all of this. So a bee, for example, has way fewer neurons even than an octopus. But a bee solves problems. It can learn and remember. It can be trained to use tools. We don't know if they will create and use tools on their own in the wild, but in the laboratory, they can be trained to use them. And the scientists who have worked with bees in the laboratory will say that the bees will even engage in play behavior. If they have little balls that the bees can roll, some of the bees will go out of their way to just spend some time rolling the balls and then get back over to wherever they were going to get some nectar or whatever. So bees, like octopuses, are invertebrates. And so I feel like this is such a great example of kind of expanding our minds to think about what is out there and what is possible. Does it matter how smart an animal is? Maybe not. Maybe it's just a chance for us to reflect on what smartness means to us. What does intelligence mean to us? But it also has a lot of real-world relevance for the animals we're talking about, because our assessment of their intelligence often determines how we protect them or don't protect them legally. In particular, vertebrates are protected in many countries around the world, including the US. They're protected from being treated inhumanely, and they're protected from being operated on without anesthetic, all kinds of things that we think are important for intelligent animals, for animals that are capable of complicated behavior. And octopuses have relatively recently been added into those sorts of protections that we used to reserve for vertebrates. Almost more than 10 years ago, the European Union expanded its directive of protection for laboratory animals to include octopuses. And there are groups that are talking about doing that in the US. And at the same time, of course, the laboratory is not the only place that we interact with animals on a regular basis. There's also farms, and farm animals have a certain amount of protection. And octopus farms, which do not currently exist, are being contemplated and potentially created in certain parts of the world. And so in advance of that, and with this idea in mind that octopuses maybe deserve similar protections to vertebrates, a number of states, actually California starting at the beginning of this year, also banned octopus farming and imports of octopus meat. And there's a bill in Congress currently being considered. And so it's just interesting to reflect on, to me, if we think that octopuses specifically deserve this level of protection. What does it mean for other cephalopods? What does it mean for other invertebrates? Are cephalopods unique in the world? And so we really do put them in this separate category of how do we think about them and how do we treat them. Their own combination of body, brain, and behavior that's really unlike anything else. Or are they just one example of the diverse intelligences and incredible behaviors that we share the world with? And they're just maybe the ones that capture our attention more than others and are getting us to start expanding our awareness and our interest. And so I think I love them. I love them an unreasonable amount. I've gotten really into octopuses more and more and more over the years. So to me, they are unique. They do things that no other animal does. Their body is structured in a way that no other animal is. But at the same time, I'm sure that's true of many other animals that I just don't know as much about. So I think both are probably true, and both are good. And that all of the different ways of thinking about them are equally good. And that is where I will end. And remember to drink water. Yes.
So you briefly talked about it. I'm probably going to struggle through this question because I don't know how to ask it. But you mentioned that they lay eggs, something I never thought about. So like, how many eggs can they lay? Do the babies get to be raised by the parent? Like, how does that stuff work? How long are they pregnant for? Like,
I'm so glad you asked. Yeah, because I could do a whole different presentation on reproductive cycles, which is wild. But in general, octopuses and other cephalopods have really short reproductive cycles, and they lay lots and lots of eggs and don't take care of them at all. But there's a lot of caveats there. So they don't take care of the babies after they hatch, but they're actually really good at taking care of the eggs before they hatch. So the typical octopus life cycle is in less than a year, it will grow to maturity, mate, and then the female will lay eggs, often hundreds, sometimes thousands, it depends on the species, sometimes tens of thousands. And she'll stay in her den with those eggs, keeping them clean, keeping predators away, not eating usually unless food comes close by, and sometimes not even then. And her body goes through a process called senescence. It starts to just fall apart. And so usually the mother dies slightly before or slightly after the eggs start hatching. And so there's no interaction between the generations. And they would probably get eaten if there were, because typically there's so many babies and they're so small that they are prey for everything that can catch them. And so the typical sort of reproductive structure, and squid did this as well, is to make lots of babies in the hopes that just a few survive. And so that those lots and lots of babies, most of them become food for other things. There are, however, some interesting exceptions. Those octopuses that I mentioned that mate beak to beak, they can actually go through multiple cycles, lay eggs, have the eggs hatch. They still don't interact with the babies hatch and leave, but then they can do it again. Their bodies don't fall apart, they don't die. There's a lot of really interesting research on why that might be and what it would mean if it sort of continued on and they had sort of generational overlap.
What makes the bodies fall apart after they, like, how do they know, like?
So there's a scientist in Seattle who's working on that, Ziyan Wang, and she is trying to figure it out. She's looking at the brains, at the hormones in the brain. There seems to be a particular part of the brain called the, you get it right, the optic gland. And scientists have found that actually surgically removing that gland prevents the senescence process from happening as quickly. So it seems to be some hormones in that gland that are driving it, but it's still just a lot of open information. I did keep talking about it, but I also wanted to open about it. Is there any more questions?
What did you name your octopus?
Thank you. So the question is, what did I name my octopus? Thank you for asking. My first octopus I named Serendipity. And she was female, and I named her after the sea monster Serendipity in a children's book that I had. And Serendipity in the book was this the sea monster that started that small and got really big and ended up sort of protecting the oceans with her size. But it's such a silly name too, because the word serendipity means like sort of a happy coincidence, right? But my octopus Serendipity was something that I planned for months. It was a very carefully planned experience.
And what did you do?
So, and she lived for about a year, a very short life, and so she just died at the end of her life. She didn't lay eggs because I didn't have multiple octopuses because they would have eaten each other. And I was really sad. She didn't get to live out her life there. I got another octopus. I named him Rex. I was a male. And not from any particular story. Maybe I was trying to be like, you can live longer. But they just don't live that long, especially the small species tend to live for less than a year. The really big ones, like a giant Pacific octopus can live maybe 5 years or even 7 years. But the little ones, it's like 6 months, 1 year. And after Rex, I had to stop eating octopuses. So it's just too sad. So I kept my aquarium and I started keeping fish that lived longer. I had a puffer fish who lived for about 10 years.
Did it respond to you, like what you did?
Yes, so what we found with the octopus, my dad helped me take care of them, is that if one of us who fed the octopus came into the room, they would come out of their den and sort of get interested in us. And it was a pretty big tank, so they had a lot of room to move around. And we would bring the food in with our fingers and they would reach up for it. And we do a little tug of war with the food and then they get the food and come down here. So it's pretty fun to watch them.
Where'd you feed?
Oh, what did you feed them? Yeah, and then I'll go on to the next section. I love it though. Thank you for asking. We actually fed them mostly frozen food. Ideally, I want to get fresh food for octopuses, and I would try whenever I could, but I lived in the heart of urban LA in North Hollywood, so I couldn't go out and collect wild crabs very much. But I could get these little cubes of frozen shrimp at the fish store, and she would eat that. Mhm.
Why did you stop having octopuses?
It made me really sad that they didn't live very long. That was really the fundamental thing, is that as a pet, it was just too short-lived for me. And I've thought sometimes that if I were to keep cephalopods again, what I would want to do is keep a sort of colony of them, which you can actually do with the very small squid, not the octopuses, because again, you don't want to be keeping multiple usually in the same tank, but they're little squid called bobtail squid that are very, very small. And scientists have actually figured out how to keep multiple generations of them. So I've thought someday, maybe when my kids are a little bit older, I might have a whole colony where I might be sad when each individual bobtail squid dies, but I would also have their eggs hatching and growing up. So that's in the back of my mind, my plan.
I actually might do that one day.
You could look into it. Uh-huh.
So was it a comet that hit the Earth all those millions of years ago? And where on the modern day Earth did it hit? And is Dr. Octopus your favorite comic book villain?
Okay, so starting at the beginning, it was an asteroid, and it hit on the Yucatan Peninsula, and there's a crater which is now buried under multiple layers, but scientists have been able to see it. Geologists can see it by doing sonar and seeing the layers of dirt. It's a huge crater. It's called the Chicxulub crater, CHIXCULUBFG. I don't know, sorry. It starts with a C. It's pronounced Chicxulub, the crater. It's gigantic. And if you ever want to read more about it, there's an incredible book by the science writer Riley Black. I think it's called The Day the Dinosaurs Died, The Last Days of the Dinosaurs, The Day the Dinosaur Died, or something. And that author, she does an amazing job. She really walks through, like, what was it like the day before impact, the moment of impact all around the world, because it really, like, it sent this shockwave all around the world. 5 minutes after, a day after, like 5 years after. It's really fun to walk through, like, just how much it changed everything. It was very cool. Let's see, so that was the asteroid and the crater, and is Doc Ock my favorite villain? I think the Doc Ock in Into the Spider-Verse is probably my favorite of all. Yeah, specifically that one. I like her. I do want to come back to the fight for the second question, but I wanted to cast my short person gaze into the back. Yes.
I'm assuming you had experiences with octopuses in the wild. Would you like to share a unique experience with us?
So I actually have more experiences with squid, interestingly. I have on a couple of dives seen octopuses. Probably my favorite experience, though, was I went scuba diving with a scientist named Roger Hanlon, who has done a lot of groundbreaking work on cephalopod patterns, recognition, their communication with each other, and their camouflage. And I was lucky enough to go on this dive with him where he had an octopus that he was sort of videoing and filming. And so I was there as his, like, keep your eyes on the octopus person. And he was also, of course, keeping his eyes on the octopus because they can disappear like that. And I don't honestly know how much help I was, because I feel like that octopus, I was staring at it the whole time. And then I'd be like, where is it? I'm just looking at kelp. There's nothing. And so I'd be like, I missed it. And I'd look over here, where did it go, where did it go? And then I'd find that Roger was filming it and it was still exactly where it was. It's absolutely amazing. But with squid, because I actually ended up doing most of my research when I worked on my PhD on squid, my favorite squid in the wild experience was I was out on a research cruise in the Gulf of Mexico. So we were out with a whole group of scientists on a boat, and everybody was doing different kinds of science. So we were fishing for the squid so people could weigh them and figure out how many of different sizes there were and how they are interacting with the environment and the temperature of the water and all this stuff. And I was studying their reproduction and development, actually, because these Humboldt squid that we were studying are about as big as me as adults, but the babies are like a grain of rice. They're teeny, teeny, tiny. And nobody at the time, this was 2005, I think, or 2006, we were in the Gulf. No one at the time had ever seen eggs in the wild. We'd seen a lot of adults, so we were pretty sure they were laying eggs, but nobody had ever seen them, because unlike octopuses, they don't have a single den. It's not like you can go to a place that they lay their eggs. They're in the open ocean, and so somewhere in the open ocean, they're laying their eggs. So I was studying the eggs actually by doing in vitro fertilization. We would get adult females, and I would get eggs from them. Adult males, I would get sperm from them, and I would mix them in petri dishes, and that's how I was studying the babies and studying how they develop. And on this cruise, and so I would be up all night because I was watching the development. I didn't want to miss anything, and you'd have an egg turn into an embryo, and I would just take photos of everything. So I was taking a nap during the day, and I got woken up by my roommate who'd been out diving, and she said, Danna, you'll never guess what we found. Eggs. Of course. And so this group of divers had found this huge egg mass. It was as big as a car. It was just this huge gelatinous mass. And they had video and they had samples. They had brought me a jar full of jelly and squid eggs. It was the first time anybody had ever seen the eggs of this squid. They were tiny, and we calculated based on the video and the density in the jars, there were maybe 1 million eggs in this car-sized mass. It was mind-blowing. Very cool. Are there any more questions? I want to give doubles in the front because I have questions that I also wanted to make sure. Are there any more questions in the back? Yes.
Do they hunt in tide pools ever?
They do.
Because I swear I saw some at Cabrillo, but I mean, I was not always sure because I was small.
Yeah, for sure. You absolutely could have. It depends on the species. You know, there's some species that never leave the deep sea, but there's a lot of intertidal octopuses that will, and they're actually like quite impressively able to crawl on land. They'll actually go up on land between tide pools and then down again by holding water in the mantle so that it's kind of like holding their breath. They can get oxygen from that for just long enough to do it. And yeah, seeing them in the tide pools is really incredible. So once, I have this one really clear memory of flipping a rock, and on the underside was this octopus actively eating a crab. I felt so rude, like I was embarrassed, the octopus was embarrassed, I was kind of so sorry, but it was pretty cool. Let's circle back, oh yes.
What are your impressions of the book, Remarkably Brave Creatures?
I really enjoyed it. I really, really enjoyed it. Yeah, I thought that the author, especially the author, doesn't really have any experience in marine biology as far as I know, but she really got into octopuses and did some research, and I felt created a really compelling character. I enjoyed it well. Yeah.
What's the chemical makeup of the ink? And have people ever made use of it?
I'm so glad you asked. So yes, people have definitely made use of it. In fact, the cuttlefish, its scientific name is sepia, because people used cuttlefish ink as the earliest sepia-toned ink. They would take the ink sac out of the cuttlefish, and it's quite concentrated in the ink sac. So if you actually dissect the animal and get the ink sac out, you can mix it with water or whatever fluid and get a lot of ink. And it's sort of brownish, blackish, it depends a little bit on the species. And the composition of it is wild. It's like a combination of, I think of it as like a combination of pepper spray and spray cheese. Like it's both to repel predators and attract them somehow at the same time, because it's really irritating if a predator gets it in their eyes, right? You can imagine any sort of inky type thing in your eyes, like that irritating, they can't see. If they breathe it in, it's hard to breathe, it's not nice. But it had these amino acids in it that smell really good. And so sometimes a squid will squirt out a cloud of ink and mucus, so it kind of holds together, and then the squid goes the other way. And then there's this glob that kind of smells nice, and the idea is that the predator will go to that thinking that it's food, and then the squid can escape the other direction. I just want to check in with my handlers. How are we doing on time?
Two more
Two more
questions.
questions, okay. Awesome, all right, I know some people in the front have them, yeah.
What's it feel like to touch it?
What does it feel like, was the question, the touch of an octopus? It's very soft. I feel like it's a combination of softness and strength, because the texture of the skin is it's not leathery, it doesn't have scales like a fish or something, it's super, super soft. But the suction cups, if they suck onto you, are incredibly strong. And one thing that's interesting is that octopus suction cups are smooth. They're very strong, they're very smooth. But some squid suction cups actually have a little ring inside them of a material that's kind of like our fingernails. And that it's got little tiny teeth on it. And it's not teeth like for biting and eating, it's more like Velcro teeth, like just for holding on to the fish or whatever they're holding on to. But I've had those squid suction cups on me with the little rings in them, and they'll actually leave marks. Not scars, sadly, I kind of wish I had squid scars. But that can be a little bit painful. But other than that, it's just like soft and strong. Mm-hmm.
So Callie would like to know why females lay eggs and not live babies.
Oh, that's such a good question. In fact, until recently, I would have said all of them actually lay eggs. But I just recently learned that there are a couple of octopuses in the deep sea that are not very well studied that actually make eggs but then keep the eggs inside their mantle. And so they do have live birth because the eggs hatch inside their mantle and then the babies come out. And I don't think anybody's been able to study them enough to know why. But most of them do lay the eggs outside of their body. And as for why they do that, that's a really good question. I think that the first thing that comes to mind is that it's just what their ancestors did. So their whole group of animals, the mollusks that include snails and clams and everybody else, that's kind of the way their bodies are set up, is to lay eggs, to put the eggs out and then to take care of them. But it's interesting that a few octopuses have evolved this ability to keep the eggs in their body. It's interesting. All right, I guess that was 2 questions. Sorry. Oh, there's one, can I take one more?
Yeah.
One more, yes, sure.
What's with the weird blood based on cyanins?
I love it. Yes,
Instead
yes.
of iron.
A hemocyanin instead of hemoglobin is what cephalopods have in their blood. The hemoglobin in our blood has iron in it. The iron binds oxygen, and that's what makes our blood red. Hemocyanin has copper in it, binds oxygen, and you know what color copper turns when it sort of rusts or corrodes? It's green, and so they have blue-green blood because of that, which is so cool. And like, what's up with it? I want to know that too, because other animals, other mollusks have red blood. Not all of them, but some of them. There's some snails that have hemoglobin. There's even other invertebrates. There's some worms that have hemoglobin. So again, I think it might just be kind of an accident. It's this kind of reminder of how evolution works, that if something is there already and it's working, then it probably isn't going to change. And so just because that's what their ancestors ended up with, it's what they have today, and it seems to be working out for them. All right, thank you guys so much.
But we have another exciting thing for the evening tonight, and that is us announcing the Battle Creek Reads for 2025, which some of you may have guessed. Remarkably great readers. If you haven't read this book, which I know a lot